With so many marriages and families falling apart, the natural question to ask is, what caused all of this? What caused all of these broken marriages and families? And that's what we discuss in this episode. I'm joined by Dr. John Bishop, who unveils the really surprising truth about what caused all these problems. Plus, we discuss things like the crisis of masculinity facing our world right now, the proper place of happiness within marriage, an awesome digital hack that he offers to protect yourself and your family and your relationships, and finally, a new resource for married men. Stay with us. Welcome to the Restored Podcast, helping you heal and grow from the trauma of your parents' divorce, separation, or broken marriage so you can break the cycle. I'm your host, Joey Panarelli. This is episode 122. We're so thrilled that so many of you have found the podcast helpful and even healing. We've heard a lot of great feedback. One listener said this: I just finished listening to episode 33, where you discussed in depth that meta-analysis study on children of divorce. You did a great job explaining the contents of that study. I'm looking forward to listening to the other episodes as well. Again, we're super happy to hear that the podcast has been not only helpful, but even healing. We do it for you. Today's episode is sponsored by Dakota Lane Fitness. If you've ever felt intimidated by working out or eating healthy, or perhaps you've tried workout programs and meal plans that just didn't work for you, then this is especially for you. Dakota Lane is a nationally certified fitness and nutrition coach who's helped about 1,000 clients worldwide, including moms of 10 kids, CEOs, MLB baseball players, 75-year-olds, and people who've never even set foot in a gym before. Dakota builds customized fitness and nutrition plans with around-the-clock accountability and one-on-one coaching for people anywhere in the world in a safe and approachable environment. But what makes Dakota unique? There's so many fitness and nutrition coaches out there. What makes Dakota unique? I want to mention three things. One, he's done it himself. He's a very healthy, ripped dude, but he's also a good, virtuous man who's not just obsessed with his looks. Second thing I'd say is he studied actually to become a priest for a little while, and through that experience and his time at Franciscan University of Steubenville and the Augustine Institute, he developed the belief that to live a fully human life involves not just growing in one area, such as your spiritual life, and neglecting the rest, like your body. We really need to care for it all so we can become more virtuous and free to love. And Dakota's mission really is to lead people to experience the highest quality of life through intentional discipline and treating their bodies the way they were made to be treated, not just to get ripped and to look good on the beach or something like that. And so if you desire freedom, if you desire transforming your body and your life, Dakota can help you. One client said this: Dakota Lane changed my life. And the best part is that what I once thought was impossible was made so doable and realistic by Dakota. This program is worth every penny. If you have struggled in the past and can't seem to find a way to change yourself for the better, look no further. Dakota Lane is your man. And so to see what Dakota offers and the amazing results that his clients have experienced, just go to dakotalanefitness.com, dakotalanefitness.com, or just click on the link in the show notes. My guest today is Dr. John Bishop. I'm really excited for you guys to hear from him. John started his professional career working at the Fellowship of Catholic University Students called Focus. During his tenure with Focus, John served as a campus missionary, and he compiled and wrote a variety of resources and even taught on a variety of topics as well. He oversaw several departments at Focus's international headquarters, but is best known for co-founding and scaling the Focus Summer Projects, an intensive collegiate summer formation program. And while working at Focus, John earned his doctorate from the Catholic University of America, writing his dissertation on the nature of masculine virtue. Super interesting. And inspired by the thought of John Paul II, John is now fighting for men and for the family as the founder and executive director of Forge, which you'll hear about in this episode. John lives in Des Moines, Iowa, with his wife, Caitlin, and their 3 children. Before jumping in, I just want to say that we do talk about God and faith in this episode. And if you don't believe in God, I'm so glad you're here. This is not a strictly religious podcast. Anyone who's been listening to this for a while knows that. And so wherever you're at, again, I'm glad you're here. I just want to issue a challenge to you if you don't believe in God. Just listen with an open mind. Even if you're to take out or skip the God part, you're still going to benefit from this episode. The other thing I wanted to say is if you happen to have kids around, this might be a good episode to put earphones in because we do talk about some mature topics. But with that, here's my conversation with Dr. John. John, so good to have you on the show. Welcome. I'm so excited to hear about the work that you're doing, what you offer to help marriages and men and families and all that. But I wanted to start with the problem. And so I'm curious, what are the main problems that married couples are facing today?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of the problems facing married couples, facing families today can be encapsulated as what you might call the difficulties brought about by the revolutions, I say. So if we were to consider the industrial revolution, the sexual revolution, and now what you might call the digital revolution, we've got a whole host of problems that have been brought to the doorstep of the family, to the doorstep of every marriage that is existing in the 21st century, particularly in developed countries. And I think the collective effect of those revolutions is to take a whole picture of marriage and family that was previously very united, a way of being that was steeped in tradition, that was interconnected across generations, that had a certain integrity to it, especially when it comes to sexuality. That whole image was kind of torn apart over the course of a couple of generations. And so the industrial revolution takes, various generations of families, and you've got then grandfathers living in one part of the country, children living in another part of the country, grandchildren still living in a third, commutes coming in, and people spending large portions of their days, in different places. You got then the sexual revolution and the ecosystem that we related to one another in sexually that constituted the foundation of many people's way of being when it comes to culture and to society at large. All that's rent asunder. And now the latest thing, just in the last couple decades, is what you might call the digital revolution. Okay, so you've got the distraction, just to name one example, of phones, the whole digital way of living that, whether in a professional context or a personal context, people relate in. All of these things together, industrial revolution, digital revolution, sexual revolution, taking that fabric of the
Mm.
family and tearing it apart. And so if I was to say concisely, what are the problems facing the family today? I would say it's the problem of the revolutions. Now, I think that that set of problems has a particularly catastrophic effect on men, particularly on a man's ability to be a committed husband and father. And it's to that set of problems that Forge, the organization I run, responds most especially.
Love that. No, so good. And I love how you added the digital revolution. I haven't really heard people talk much about that. Of course, we hear about the industrial and the sexual revolutions, but that's fascinating. One of the things, just kind of a side note, I love about you, I remember when we were texting recently to kind of set up this interview, you mentioned like, hey, I'm shutting my phone down for the night. And I was like, that's amazing. Talk about that for a second. What's that habit that you guys have?
Well, like perhaps many of our listeners today, I am hopelessly addicted to the nicotine that is pumping out of my iPhone, and I've not made the jump and gone to a dumb
Yeah.
phone. Although I applaud the people who do. Props to you. I've not taken the leap myself, but my wife and I have made the decision at different points in our marriage, and with a renewed fervor in the last 6 months, to have portions of our day that are basically technology free. And the biggest kind of threat I take when it comes to technology is the threat of an iPhone, and my wife has an iWatch. But what we'll do, it's a pretty simple system. We have an old shoebox that sits in the coat closet right by our front door. Okay, and sits on the top shelf. There's no lock on it or anything like that. It's a cardboard box, so you can grab whatever's in it pretty easily. But you do have to go through the intentional act of getting whatever's inside it. And from 5:15, which is about the time when I'm wrapping up work every day, through to when our toddlers go down to bed, so about 7:30, we'll just go no technology whatsoever in our home. Now we do a similar thing on Sundays as well, so that there is some time where our family is interacting with one another. That sacred space, which is our vocations, the center, just the most intimate part of our lives, is not kind of impinged upon by the $1 trillion industry, which is contemporary technology. I mean, if you think about it, anytime that you have an iPhone or any other device of that nature in your sphere, there is literally a $1 billion-trillion industry that is bent on getting in contact with you. So you shouldn't be surprised when that $1 trillion industry threatens your ability to have a good conversation with your wife, your ability to have a meaningful interaction with your child. And I think that it's really just something that everyone should consider. Just having periods of time set aside where you've got no technology, at least in the modern sense. Now, somebody might ask, when you hear about these policies, what if somebody absolutely has to get a hold of you? Well, I've got another tip for that. So something my wife and I have also done: get a landline. So it's been one of the most freeing things for us is take a time warp, go back to the days of the Neanderthals, get a landline. And we have maybe a dozen people in our lives, some close friends, my parents, back before I founded my own ministry, my direct supervisors at work, they all had the numbers for those landlines, so that if you absolutely need to get a hold of me, there's still the option there. Right. But you got to call that number. It's got to be a pretty intentional thing. And so I think in a couple of years of having that landline, there was like 3 calls, over the course of that whole time that actually got through. So anyway, that's how we approach it. So a lot of different and wonderful ways to approach technology.
No, I love it. And I'm sure there's a lot of barriers that people will think of, when it comes to like doing some sort of routine like that, which I love. I want to talk to my wife about doing it because recently after texting you and you saying that, I realized like, my goodness, there's so many moments, even though we're pretty good with it, there's so many moments where like, you're on your phone and, my daughter's like standing right there. It's like, oh, I don't want to be doing that. And so, no, I love that. And one of the things too, like for me, my brain always puts up different barriers, like I mentioned, that people might be thinking of. And like one of them is like, I'm like, I have such a restless mind. Like I'm always having new ideas and thoughts and things that I need to like get into some system. Otherwise I'll just forget them. And so one of the things I realized early on is like pen and paper. It's like, you can just like have that next to your bed or your couch or wherever and write that down. And then later you put that into, your phone or your task system or whatever. And so I think there are like a lot of great solutions, at the alarm solution too. It's like, well, buy an alarm clock.
I mean, not really rolling the clock back that far, but just rolling it back 20, 30 years really ups your game in terms of your freedom to focus on the relationships that are in your presence at any given moment. And so little step that we've decided to take, and it's been generally a good thing. We practice it very imperfectly.
Yeah, no, I mean, even doing it imperfectly. And I've even seen like the most disciplined people that I know, they might only succeed at their discipline like 80 to 90% of the time, but that's still a win. If you hit a baseball 80 to 90% of the time, you're like unheard of. So I think it's an incredible thing. No, so good. And so much more I'm sure we can say about that, but I appreciate like your example and just wanted to applaud that. Going back to this whole discussion of like the problems that are facing marriages today, I think one of them is that there's so many lies when it comes to lies about love. And so I'm just curious, kind of what are some of the poisons or what are some of the lies that are poisoning marriages when it comes to love?
Yeah, Joey, when I think about lies poisoning marriage today, I think, gosh, what comes to mind for me is the notion of the language of the body. All right. So some of our listeners may have heard of this. Some of them may have not heard of it. But the idea of the language of the body is that the body is designed in a certain way so as to speak a language. Okay. So for example, you can't do something with your body and have it mean just anything, Now some things you can. So like, for example, the language, which is sign language, is entirely contrived, and we could make a new symbol that would mean whatever we want it to mean. Okay. But there are some things when they're done with the body that mean something very specific, and it would be difficult to change the meaning of those things, at least drastically, across time and place. Right. So like, for example, if I was to, reach through the cybersphere right now, and punch you in the nose, Joey, it would be very difficult for me to convince you that that means I love you. Right. And, in the same way, the things that we do with our bodies sexually express a certain thing, and so, for example, the sexual act expresses a certain degree of commitment, right? Because after all, in the natural, I keep using the word ecosystem today, it must be the word of the day. In the natural ecosystem of sexuality, there is at least some relation between sexuality and children, right? So to engage in sexuality in an entirely casual, switching partners all of the time type of fashion can cause a kind of confusing effect on the body because, well, after all, our psychology isn't developed so as to interact with one another in that way. All right. Now, when people ask me, and I'm going to give a little bit of an old take here, but simultaneously a hot take. When people ask me, what are some of the most difficult effects that are facing marriages today? If I had to pick one, I would pick contraception. I would say that in the sexual ecosystem, running with this analogy a little bit more, if there's any core thing that has brought about a destabilization of our sexual culture at large, and also of our individual relationships with one another, I think it's the effect of contraception. And it's interesting. I've actually found religious or non-religious, more millennials and Gen Z folks who are entirely amenable to this position. So like, for example, I was in a production studio 4 or 5 months ago with a couple of artists who were basically running the tech and the sound in the studio, entirely non-religious people. And one of these men had decided to throw contraception out of his marriage because he felt as though he was basically introducing something that was unnatural into this very intimate relationship that he had with his wife. So he and his wife had started using natural methods of either pursuing or avoiding pregnancy in their relationship. And he spoke about what a wonderful effect it had had on his specific relationship with his wife, as if everything had become to some extent more authentic, you know? So thinking of this idea of the language of the body, the way in which he spoke to his wife, sort of spoke to her physically, had been greatly enhanced by doing things in a more natural way. I've heard people use the term green sex before. So that's individual relationships, but then society at large. When I think of the sexual revolution and the destabilization of marriage and family that's happened over the course of the last 2, 3 generations, that destabilization was largely brought about, or at least fanned into flame, by the advent of the pill, of contraception. And I don't think we would have many of the problems that we have in the family today were it not for contraception.
I totally agree with you. Contraception led to an increase in abortion, obviously, and then it led to the problem that we honestly are facing in my apostolate, which is divorce, right? Broken families. Just how, along with the contraceptive mentality kind of elevated the feelings and the happiness, quote unquote, of the adults over anything else, really. And so if I was happier running off with this other woman, even though I made a commitment to my spouse, if that was going to make me happy, then I should just go ahead and do that, even if it left so much damage in my wake. And I think that kind of contraceptive mentality has just plagued our society in so many ways.
I think that's right. Yeah, it's taken a very intimate part of our beings as humans, that is the sexual dimension of our beings, a dimension that is ultimately oriented towards making a gift of oneself, and which involves a kind of submission to the natural order, that God imbued in the universe, and kind of flips it on its head, right? Where sex becomes not gift, but take. And where the orientation that we bring into sexuality, or our approach to it, maybe to use a better term, doesn't assent to the natural, but rather sets itself up against nature, And I just think that has all kinds of primary, secondary, tertiary negative effects across human psychology, that we really work destruction on ourselves, on our own ability to be sexually satisfied even, when we introduce that kind of toxin, that kind of unnatural element into a very delicate ecosystem.
So good. I couldn't agree more. I remember seeing a secular headline saying, talking about pornography, it was saying porn is ruining sex for everyone. We're facing so many problems now with people, with erectile dysfunction, all sorts of issues that, stem from, again, this kind of, like you're saying, this warped version of sexuality that we sometimes think of as liberty, but in the end, it's not really making us more free. It's actually enslaving us to something that we never really wanted or desired in the first place.
Yeah, pornography is a great example. And, I was talking to somebody who runs pornography recovery groups earlier this morning, and I'm preparing in a few weeks now for my own apostolate to launch similar groups. Porn might be kind of if contraception is at the root of the stream, pornography might be where the stream of our sexual dysfunction kind of bottoms out, where you have another instance of inauthenticity, sexual inauthenticity, being consumed on a regular basis and rendering people less able to be sexually authentic, right? I mean, is there any greater contradiction to this idea of the language of the body than relating to the pixels on a computer screen, right? Or on an iPhone screen, that pornography warps us so easily. And I want to point out something there. The word warp, I think, is exactly correct, that our sexual preferences, our ability to sexually relate to an actual real human being are deeply warped by pornography. I had an intimate series of conversations with a number of people who were more or less struggling with same-sex attraction, who had no difficulties with same-sex attraction whatsoever prior to starting to use pornography. And the allure of heterosexual porn couldn't really satisfy them, so to speak, anymore. So then they kind of just kept moving to, another form of novelty, down the line of the pornographic train, and found themselves with an even more distorted view of sexuality than when they began. And I can't help but think that pornography is sort of the bridge, the gateway drug to so many sexual manipulations, in so many people, both of their own psychology, of the sexual abuse that comes about as a result of pornography, and so many other disheartening things. So Yeah, fight the new drug. If you haven't been to the website, go and fightthenewdrug.org and wake up to the fact that, yeah, it'll be difficult to get off pornography if you're in any way connected to it, but it's a fight worth fighting.
The best way I've heard it said from Fight the New Drug and people like Jason Evert and Matt Fradd is that, porn just destroys your ability to love because it just teaches you to use people. And there's no way you can build an authentic relationship built on real love if all you're looking is to just use someone for your own gratification. And so that's a big topic. I'm sure we could go much deeper there, but I'm just curious if there are any other maybe lies around marriage that you've seen really destroy marriages. And I wanted to offer one, if that's okay. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. And that is, just believing that like the purpose of marriage is happiness. Because I think so often in our culture, we see it as like this vehicle, this tool, this way of becoming like happier. And what I've seen, what I've learned is like the purpose of marriage is not happiness. The purpose of marriage is holiness. There's nothing in the marriage vows that actually, the traditional marriage vows that promise happiness. And I know that sounds super unromantic, but I think it's so important because what I've seen, especially in doing this work, is like underneath almost every divorce is this, belief, conscious or not, that, we expect our spouse to make us perfectly happy. And if they don't, then we might think, man, maybe I married the wrong spouse, or maybe I even picked the wrong vocation or whatever. And we might even be tempted to leave. And many people do. And so I think that's one thing that I think we need to get back to, is that it's not just meant to be this like walk in the park, this easy thing. It's meant to be something that is going to make us the best version of ourselves, so to speak. Is meant to make us holy. And it's meant to help us to, uproot the vices that we have and to replace those with virtues and so many other things. But I think it's really freeing actually to hear that, because then, okay, my marriage is not just subject to the whims of my feelings or, my quote unquote happiness. It's really, there's this greater purpose and this greater goal in all of it.
Yeah, I love what you said. I'm going to play with that for a little bit and tell me what you think of this. So, on the one hand, you might say that it would be a mistake to enter a marriage if your idea of marriage is just to make you more happy in some shallow sense of happiness. So like, for example, I will enter into this marriage because I really enjoy going on trips with this person, or I love the way that our tastes complement one another, or whatever it is. That understanding of happiness, which is, I think, unfortunately, the view of happiness that a lot of millennials, Gen Zs, even baby boomers before us took into marriage, is the attitude that brought about so many broken families. All right. Now, ultimately, I do think that marriage serves the purpose of making people more happy. But I want to say this, and this is really just kind of what I'd love for you to try and emphasize. The purpose of marriage is not happiness. The purpose of marriage is to explode your idea of happiness. All right. So it's like, look, I am convicted that anybody who enters into marriage and is married for longer than 20 minutes will suffer to a degree that they could not have possibly anticipated. So it's like, no matter how experienced you are when it comes to your understanding of marriage, if you've got a doctorate in psychology and another doctorate in theology, and you love John Paul II, and you're just all about marriage, and you've dated the person well and whatever, I don't care. Marriage is going to break you. That's how that's going to go, almost no matter what. That is, that you will hit points in your marriage that will bring you to your knees. It will be so hard, but that difficulty will open up your interiority, open up your spirit to entire vistas of happiness that were previously unavailable to you. So it's like, I think one of the things that makes marriage so brilliant is that it takes place till death do you part. That is, when couples sign up to get married, they could not possibly have an idea ultimately of what their marriage is going to look like 20 years later. Nevertheless, you're committed to somebody, and something psychologically happens for people when you start. I've only been married for 5 years, so not a very long period of time in relation to a lot of people who have much more business talking about this topic than either of us do. But something kind of settles into like the way that you love somebody when the years keep passing by. And there's a way in which the suffering gets more heavy, I guess you could say. I don't know that I like that term, but the suffering gets at least more real. But simultaneously, your vanities die. Your ability to actually understand a person and accept them for all of the different facets of their being is heightened beyond measure in a way that it could never be heightened if there was even the smallest bit of openness to ending the relationship. It's like when people say that yeah, we've been married for 7 years, but we're open to it ending someday. What I want to say to them is, well, actually, you haven't been married for even a single minute, because you haven't been married at all until you've been married till death do you part. Because there's a threshold that you cross over when you enter into that kind of commitment that actually sets you free to love a person in the way that only their spouse can love them. That is only the way that somebody who's committed until death do you part, no matter what, can love them. And so, sure, like, I suppose people shouldn't enter marriage to, quote, be happy. That is, if they have a false, shallow understanding of happiness. But if they want to have a much deeper understanding of happiness, that is, if you want your vision of happiness to be exploded into something so much better than it actually is now, then get married.
Beautiful.
Because you don't know what marriage is going to be. There's no way to perfectly prepare. But your vision of happiness will be exploded and deepened.
So good. No, I love that. And I love that distinction between like the shallow sense of happiness and this, deeper sense of happiness. Because I totally agree with you. When I talk about happiness, when I give talks on this topic, or, talk about the lie that we're often fed that, the purpose of marriage is happiness, I am thinking more of like that shallow sense of kind of gratification or comfort or pleasure, something that, again, is more fleeting and, is just kind of meant to give us some sort of a high. And we certainly would say, that's not the purpose of marriage. But I love that you're refocusing in this, that, there is such a deeper sense of joy, fulfillment, satisfaction. I don't know what other word you would use, that can result from this continual process, like you said, of, suffering and then growing, suffering and growing. And it's really analogous to working out. I don't, I hope this analogy is okay for people, but, the process of working out, of making your body stronger, is literally you need to suffer to break, like literally, on the muscular level, your muscles are like being pulled apart, like destroyed, so to speak. I'm not a scientist, but this is what it's been explained to me. And then afterward, the recovery is actually what makes you stronger. And so I think when it comes to marriage, totally, like I know, for us, there's been really difficult seasons already in our marriage. We've been married about 6 years, we're basically married as long as you guys. And there's been some difficult, trying times. But then at the end of that tunnel, if we work through it and stick with it, which gets to your point of like having that commitment to stick with it, there's something that is much more beautiful at the end of it. And I think a lot of people call it quits before they get to experience that.
I think that's right. I think a lot of people call it quits before they experience the real goodness of marriage. The high, the honeymoon high is so fleeting, but the real good of it is much better than the honeymoon. And it only comes with a little bit of time, in my experience. And I'm looking forward to, I have the grace. My parents have been married for coming up on 40 years now. And I had Thanksgiving dinner with my mom and dad. We hosted this year. They and my siblings all came over for Thanksgiving dinner. And at Thanksgiving dinner, we did the typical thing. We went around the table and said what we were thankful for. Okay. And we got to my parents, to my mom and my dad, who've had difficulties in their marriage of many different sorts. But they looked at one another and they both started bawling their eyes out, and just kind of just out of the blue saying what they were thankful for. And my dad, looking at my mom, this is not exaggerated even a little bit. My dad, looking at my mom, said, I can't tell you how happy I am to be married to you. And, in front of all of his children and grandchildren and everything. And my mom looked right back at him and said the same thing. And then my dad said, I feel like in the last 3 years of our marriage, we've become more happy than we've ever been before. And if you think about that, like, that would mean, so they've been married like 39 years now. That would mean that around marriage, year number 36, they started to descend into this whole nother, they had a happy marriage before that already. They've had a great marriage pretty much all the way through with some really notable difficulties. But around year 36, they hit this spot of like a whole new level of depth, as if the bottom had fallen out to a level of meaning that they hadn't previously had access to. That's the kind of happiness that marriage can bring you. But it's very different than the kind of happiness that you were rightly shining a light on before.
Wow. No, so beautiful. And I'd love to go deeper a little bit into that, because the people listening right now so often haven't seen that example of what a beautiful, healthy marriage looks like. Not a perfect one. And so talk me through a little bit of that. Like, maybe what were some of like the lessons or takeaways that you have witnessing your parents' marriage over the years?
Gosh, I look forward someday to speaking with you about this for 7 hours. So let me try and say some concise things now. Here are a few things. My dad never stopped pursuing my mom. I don't think he ever did. I think he was always after her. even though he'd already won her heart, they're sleeping together every night, they're married, they're got a bunch of kids, whatever. But they were always doing things for one another that were sort of romantic, just going after it. Like I remember there were a few years where my dad's business kind of fell apart. And so money was really tight in the house. And I remember there was this anniversary and my mom kind of got us kids together. And the older ones of us knew this, though she didn't say it, that they didn't have money to go out to eat. And so what my mom did is she had all of us, some of us young boys, we dressed up in suits. So we had suits and ties on, and we set the dinner table just kind of like in a nicer way and put candles out and everything. And mom made this like really nice dinner for dad. And then by the time he got home, most of the kids were upstairs, like watching a movie. But me and one of my brothers, we were downstairs. And our job was to kind of like, in a sort of showy way, like bring the food out and put it down there wearing suits for mom and dad. And so they did stuff like that for one another. In the midst of the difficulty, I mean, I think that story is particularly good because, I think the deepening of married love oftentimes involves a simultaneous mix of bliss and excruciating suffering. And it's the cocktail of those two things that makes for real happiness. So you've got something particularly bad going on, like you're broke or whatever your thing is. And you sprinkle in the midst of that a little bit of good, cheap romance, the kind that you can come up with, on a Costco bottle of wine and about, box of mac and cheese or something like that, like you have those two things together. And I think that makes for something really good, as the years go on. So that's just one thought, that comes to mind.
Man, there's so much we've covered and so much I want to cover with you, but I was just curious if there's anything else you would add when we're talking about this problem that, problems that are facing marriages today, specifically when it comes to men. We've already talked a bit about pornography and some of the other things like contraception, but just curious if there's anything you'd add when it comes to the problems men in marriage are facing.
Yeah, so the issues that have faced humanity when it comes to the sexual revolution in particular have had the effect of crippling marriages in general, but crippling men in particular. All right. So if you examine particularly the last two generations of men, when it comes to interest in marriage and interest in family, there has been a sharp, precipitous decline in the number of men who want to be married that far outstrips their feminine counterparts. All right. So the number of particularly religious women who find themselves climbing the ladder of their 20s, 30s, and 40s and completely unable to find a man who's willing to be their partner is very high in this day and age. And I read a great sociologist on this. He wrote a book called The Decline of Males. He's got kind of an unfortunate name. His name is Lionel, Linel, Tiger. He's an evolutionary sociologist at Rutgers University. Anyway, Dr. Tiger, who wrote this book, Decline of Males, again, a non-religious person himself, said that the chief cause contributing to the decline of men in our society is the advent of contraception, because what it effectively did to men was take an already kind of tenuous connection that men felt with their children. I mean, throughout the whole course of human history, it's been more difficult to get men to commit to their children than it is to get women to commit to their children. I mean, think about it. Women, after conceiving a child, they bear the child in their womb for 9 months. They oftentimes then feed the child at their breasts. And so there's a connection that is forged there universally for women that is not the same for men. And so the great kind of task oftentimes of culture is getting men to be more than mere reproducers, but to be husbands and to be fathers. That is, to be committed to their families, right? And the way in which contraception has made sex so readily available, both in contraceptive sex period, but then in all of the things that contraception has brought forth, not least of which is pornography, has made men relatively less interested in sexuality. There are a lot of other deeper things at play too, when you think, for example, of in a society that is marked by largely licentious sexual practices, the ability of a man even to know, if a child is his or not, prior to modern paternity tests drastically declines. And so that already weak link between a father and a child is gone. So this one author, for example, says that in the modern culture, in the modern state, the holy trinity of time gone by, that is the holy trinity of a husband, a wife, and a child, has now in the contemporary sexual culture been replaced by a new trinity, which is a mother, a child, and ordinarily a bureaucrat, or a welfare handout, or any of the modern day kind of stand-ins for the father. And so Forge, the organization that I run, leans in a particular way in giving men guidance to become great husbands and fathers. And that emphasis on men is not chauvinism. It's actually recognizing a kind of weakness that men, particularly contemporary men, have, and the need for guidance. I think in the midst of that too, when you throw in the fact that a lot of the cultural things which traditionally guided young boys to become great men, those things have been replaced by, for example, the idea of toxic masculinity has had the effect of leaving boys pretty lost. Whereas previous cultures gave young men a guide for what it looked like to walk the path towards authentic masculinity, taking boys to men, that guide has been replaced with a question mark. That we've given young boys really just confusion now about what it means to be male, about what it means to be masculine. And they want answers. If they don't find answers from good, wholesome sources like educational systems or like churches, then young boys will look for answers about masculinity in other places like YouTube or God forbid, like the streets, which is why I think, for example, you see like an influx in gangs. You see an influx in what I take to be some toxic male personalities like Andrew Tate, because young boys are not getting wholesome masculinity, positive masculinity from the places that previously gave it. They're kind of being forced to look for it in the gutters. And so you have the crisis of men, the crisis of masculinity, brought about by something which was supposed to make us more free, the sexual revolution, but which indeed introduced a kind of chaos and a new, more sinister kind of slavery.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And especially looking at boys, like I think anyone could recognize how much of a problem we're facing there. And what I've seen too is that, as a boy, like when you're growing up, early teen years, especially, you're trying to develop your strength, right? You're hopefully looking to become this like strong man. And that's even gone amiss in so many ways. Like we're not even looking to develop boys into strong men, or boys might not even see that as some sort of a goal. But of course, that is the goal. It's like to develop a strength so that then we can offer. And that's the other side of the coin that I've seen. And so you're right. If we don't have someone who's helping us develop that strength, not just the physical strength, but the moral strength, the interior strength to becoming more virtuous, all those things, and we don't have a clear outlet, a place to offer our strength, then yeah, it's just going to turn into just disastrous, just lead us down disastrous routes. And it's so interesting to see how you mentioned the streets. It's kind of fascinating to think how gang leaders, you could probably throw in cartel leaders, terrorist leaders, whoever, are often some of the most like effective leaders, especially when it comes to men, because they breathe like this purpose into their existence. They help them to channel that strength into something, whether it's good or bad. And for men, it's like, yeah, you're speaking my language. Like I need to do something with my strength. And so, yeah, you hit the nail on the head so well. And I'm sure there's so much more you could say. Before we move on, I just want to give you a chance to comment.
Yeah, I think what you said about gang leaders is particularly appropriate. Young boys have male raw material. Across time and place, every society except for the last couple generations of Western societies, they've had actual things like initiation rites. And now granted, some of those initiation rites were bad. All right, but let's set that aside for a moment. Across all times and places, there were channels that took that male energy, if you will, and did that channeled it into masculinity. All right. We don't have those today, but boys still want to be channeled. No matter how loud the culture preaches to young boys that there's no such thing as masculinity, that it's a fiction or whatever it is, that doesn't change the fact that boys still want to be men. Whether you're willing to give them an image of masculinity or not, they still want to be men. And so when a gang leader or a YouTube personality or some sort of public figure gives them an image of masculinity that they can latch onto, and even more so if they give them a kind of club, if you will, that affirms them in their masculinity, I mean, a literal gang, to use your example, then they feel masculine all the more. All right. And it's this particular thing, not to kind of tout my own product here, if you will, that led the organization that I lead. We just recently released a course. You can find it on the homepage of our website. It's called Fathers and Sons. And so if you go to myforge.org, myforge.org, you can see this course. And what it is it's a 6-part series that instructs fathers on the healthy sexual formation of their sons. Okay, so what does it look like, for example, in the absence of an initiation rite of 1752, of time gone by, but to do the good thing that initiation rites previously did and give your son an image of masculinity that he can aspire towards, right? What does it look like to talk to your son about sexuality before the world manipulates him? What does it look like to introduce your son into a community of men much better than the community of a gang that will at the same time affirm him in his masculinity so that he doesn't go look for that same affirmation elsewhere. What does that look like? So my organization got together with groups of psychologists around the country to put a curriculum together. We just call it Fathers and Sons. It's a 6-part series to help men transform their boys into great husbands and fathers for the next generation.
I love the focus on making men strong so that they then can offer their strength to their wives, to their children, to society as a whole. Because it's so interesting to me looking at like stories, for example, how, often the difference between the hero and the villain is that the hero uses his strength for good, the villain uses his strength for bad. It's kind of a simplistic way of explaining it, but that's the way that I see it.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I think it's like so good if we can, help boys become men and, step into those roles. So I want to hear a little bit more about your organization, if you would, in closing. Like, what solutions do you guys offer to all of these problems that we have talked about today, in addition to the course that you mentioned?
Yeah. So we're an organization that's fundamentally devoted to the family, but in our efforts to build up the family, we have a strategic emphasis on men. In our first 2 years of operations, so we're just 4 months old. In our first 2 years of operations, we're focusing exclusively on men. As we continue forward, we'll also develop materials for women. But what we do, we say we champion the good of the family, and then we evangelize by virtue of that flourishing. So we do things like develop great resources, facilitate empowering interpersonal experiences like small groups and mentorship, so as to bring great families into the contemporary world, despite the revolutions, like we said at the start of this episode, the industrial, digital, sexual revolutions, all of which kind of tear at the fabric of the family. We aim to reverse that trend. Okay, so we're fundamentally an organization that seeks to inspire a movement of families that are fully alive. We do a lot of our on the ground stuff, virtually all of it at this point, in Des Moines, Iowa. So we've got a lot of small groups of husbands and fathers going in Des Moines, future husbands and fathers going here in Des Moines, large events, that we put together. Soon here, we'll start sexual accountability groups. We do mentorship we call it intergenerational mentorship. So between husbands and fathers of one generation in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, mentoring men who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. We do a lot of stuff like that. But we do have a growing national platform. So, for example, if you go to our website, I think at present we have people doing our first course in over 30 cities. That is small groups of men who have gotten online, bought our first course, say, hey, I want to know what it looks like to develop a son who is flourishing in the sexual dimension of his being. And I'd like to, with another group of men, talk about what it looks like to raise that kind of son. So we say, and this is, a lot of this is brought out. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the crisis of men and masculinity in the church and in the culture. And one of the things that I became deeply convicted about over the course of writing that dissertation was that the best of men are oftentimes not raised by a single man, that is, by a single father, if you will. The best of men are raised by groups of men. So one of the best things that you can do to raise a great family, particularly to raise great sons, is to intentionally involve yourself in a group of like-minded men who will be a voice for you in saying things that your son won't hear from your voice, okay, that he needs to hear from the voice of your friends, right? So we develop the materials that we developed for the men's small group for that reason, that we really don't think that individuals, marriages, or families are meant to do the family, the marriage, the human flourishing thing on an island, but are indeed meant to do it in the context of community. And so that's why we develop the resources in the way that we do. So hop on the website, myforge.org. If you go to courses and content, we also have free materials, articles, podcasts, things of that nature as well. But you can also see the courses that we put out there, particularly our first course that is on the topic of raising sexually healthy sons. We'll release 2 more courses in September. One of those courses is on the domestic church. So what does it mean to pass the faith from one generation to the next? And then finally, a course called Patriarchs, which is on the role of grandfathers in contemporary society.
Love that. And I think it's so inspiring. I know we probably don't have a lot of these type of people listening right now, but older men who maybe feel like their time is kind of done. They maybe built a business, or they, served in the military, or did whatever with their life. And then they reach this kind of like sage stage in masculinity, and they kind of think, well, kind of finished, I'm not as useful as I used to be. But I love what you're saying, especially on that last course, about how, no, this is actually the time in your life when you can have the greatest impact, where it can be like the most fruitful. And I just love that. I think that's so inspiring for so many reasons. So good. And John, I always love talking with you, man. And you're always welcome back, and we'll have to do another show. But yeah, just really appreciate you and everything that you're doing, and appreciate you coming on the show. And with that, I wanted to just give you the final word. Like, what final encouragement, advice would you offer to everyone listening, especially our audience who, comes from broken families, when it comes to this topic of love, of marriage, of fatherhood, and everything we've discussed?
Just that, Joey, I think you're right on the money in what you're doing. And the people who are engaging your resources, I think they're doing exactly the right thing. There's an old Latin saying, nemo dat quod non habet. And that translates to basically, you can't give what you don't have. And I think that, a lot of the work that I do when it comes to building up men, marriages, and families, we don't have a particular eye towards divorce or any of the things that you lean into specifically. So many of the issues in parenting style can be fixed by healing your own brokenness. So much of what I think what my organization does is encourage people to take their own healing seriously, so that brokenness doesn't just keep going down the generations. And so obviously the pain of divorce can wreak havoc. That is so painful. I mean, obviously you speak quite a bit about that, Joey, and could not highlight the value of your organization anymore. So for all the listeners, I was not paid to say that, but I think that this is such critically important work. So thank you for what you're doing.
If you like that, if you want more from Dr. John, I definitely recommend checking out his organization called Forge. Again, you can learn more about them at their website, myforge.org. Again, myforge.org, or just click on the link in the show notes. If you want to learn more about natural family planning, the method John kind of mentioned in passing to achieve or avoid a pregnancy, two resources I would recommend from speaker and author Jason Evert. The first is an audio talk called Green Sex. And if you're an audio person, this is a great way to learn more about this whole thing of natural family planning. If you're more of a reader, you can pick up his book called Pure Intimacy. It's actually a booklet. It's a really short read. And so that's Pure Intimacy, especially if you're a reader. That's a good one for you. Again, you can get all that by clicking the links in the show notes to get either the talk Green Sex or the booklet Pure Intimacy. Again, just click in the show notes if you want one of those. If you come from a divorced or broken family, or maybe you know someone who does, we offer more resources than just this podcast. Those resources include things like a book, video courses, speaking engagements, free assessment, online community, and much more. All of our resources are designed to help you heal from the trauma you've endured and build virtue so you can break that cycle and build a better life. And so if you want to view those resources for yourself or someone that you know, you can go to restoredministry.com/resources, or just click on the link in the show notes. That wraps up this episode. If you know someone who's struggling because of their parents' divorce or broken family, feel free to share this podcast with them. I promise you they will be very grateful. Feel free to even take 30 seconds now if you want to share it with them. In closing, always remember that you are not alone. We're here to help you feel whole again and break the cycle of dysfunction and divorce in your own life. And keep in mind the words of C.S. Lewis, who said, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending."